Silicon Valley, The Autopsy of Ambition. On December 8, 2019, HBO aired the final episode of Silicon Valley. 6 seasons. 53 episodes. 5 consecutive Emmy nominations for Outstanding Comedy Series. But here's what matters. The show ended because it ran out of story to tell. The startup that launched the series, Pied Piper, never actually won. Richard Hendricks, played by Thomas Middleditch, spent 6 years fighting for survival and never secured the victory that would have ended the narrative. The show's creators realized the same thing their protagonist couldn't: sometimes the ending isn't triumph. Sometimes it's just exhaustion. In April 2014, Mike Judge, John Altschuler, and Dave Krinsky did something that shouldn't have worked. They made a comedy about the exact moment they were living in, the Silicon Valley of 2014, with its compression algorithms and venture capital sharks and founders sleeping in incubators. They cast Thomas Middleditch as Richard Hendricks, a programmer who built an app with a revolutionary data compression algorithm while working at a megacorporation called Hooli. Richard's story was simple and specific: win the demo, get the funding, survive the politics. At TechCrunch Disrupt in Season 1, Richard's competitor, Gavin Belson, played by Matt Ross, presented Hooli's knockoff product called Nucleus. Belson had reverse-engineered Pied Piper. But Richard coded all night and returned with a superior product. He was mobbed by investors. This should have been the end. Instead, it was Chapter 1. In Season 2, the lawsuits came. Hooli claimed Richard had stolen the algorithm on company time. Venture capital firms, terrified of legal exposure, withdrew their funding offers. This is where the show's genius lived. It wasn't mocking the technology. It was mocking the machinery around it: the lawyers, the board seats, the binding arbitration clauses in employment contracts that nobody reads. Richard accepted funding from Russ Hanneman, a billionaire played by Chris Pine whose money came with constant interference. Then Ravaga Capital, led by Lori Bream, bought out Hanneman and promptly removed Richard as CEO. By Season 2's end, the founder had lost control of his own company. Seasons 3 through 6 became a loop. Richard regained power. Richard lost power. New CEOs came and went. Jack Barker failed. Jian Yang, the Chinese incubator resident played by Jimmy O. Yang, somehow became more successful with a knockoff version. Big Head, Nelson Bigetti, played by Josh Breener, stayed employed at Hooli despite having no actual value, promoted higher and higher as cover for Belson's lies. The company never went public. The founder never won cleanly. Here's what the show understood that most startup narratives don't: the problem was never the technology. Pied Piper's compression algorithm was real. It worked. It beat Nucleus. But the moment Richard created value, he became valuable, which meant other people wanted to control him. Belson wanted to steal it. Hanneman wanted to dominate him. Ravaga wanted to replace him. The legal system, the venture capital structure, the board composition, these weren't obstacles to success. They were the actual machinery of Silicon Valley, and they were designed to extract value from people like Richard and transfer it to people like Lori Bream and Gavin Belson. The show's real insight was darker than a joke about bad code. It was that the system worked as intended. Richard kept losing his company because the system was designed for founders to lose their companies. Venture capital doesn't fund inventors, it funds investors who use inventors to generate returns. A founder with technical brilliance but no business experience was always going to be vulnerable to boards, lawyers, and better-connected competitors. Seasons 1 and 2 were brilliant because they showed Richard at the inflection point, the moment when his creation became someone else's asset. Seasons 3 through 6 became repetitive because there was nowhere left to go. Every path led to the same conclusion: the founder doesn't win. The system does. Silicon Valley ended not because it ran out of jokes. Mike Judge could have mined this world forever, but because it had proven its thesis completely. The show's real failure wasn't a failure of storytelling. It was a failure of hope. Once you've shown that the structure is rigged, you can't keep pretending the protagonist has agency. The lesson isn't about startups. It's about systems. A good satire doesn't just mock individual greed or stupidity. It reveals structural problems. But once a structure reveals itself completely, satire becomes repetition. Silicon Valley taught viewers that venture capital, intellectual property law, and corporate boards are mechanisms for transferring control from makers to managers. Once that was proven, once Richard had lost his company for the third time and nothing had changed, there was nothing left to say. The show's greatest achievement was understanding that in Silicon Valley, the only real failure is the one the system allows you to survive.